Hey everyone, so we are going to finish up this unit with notebook page 4. If you want to pause the video and write down the title card, experimental ethics is what we'll talk about. It's only 3 slides long, and I think it's something good to conceptualize. So pause this if you want to do the title card. If not, we will move on to the first slide here. So we're going to talk about ethics today, and when we do experiments in science, including psychology, they have to be conducted in a way that treats any subject, whether it's humans, whether it's animals, humanely. Can we cause pain in these experiments? Can we cause trauma, discomfort? What about using children if we want to study children? What do we have to do to make sure it's ethical? What about with animals? Is there a difference between humans and animals and how we should treat them? So these are a lot of questions that come up. Where do we draw the line of what is okay and what's not? And so what we've kind of done to make sure that people and animals are treated well is that the U.S. government and other governments, universities, they've created groups and associations to kind of regulate psychological experimentation today and make sure that they're humane, even if they weren't in the past. So we don't want to do those things that I mentioned before. We don't want to cause pain to people, have to do that. We don't want to cause trauma to people or animals or discomfort. Or children, you have to have parental consent. You have to make sure that they're being treated ethically. Certain animals, we definitely have to treat almost the same as humans. So a lot of those questions that I brought up before are things that we need to avoid and may not have been avoided in the past. So let me put up the slide, and you can write this down in your own words. Pause the video now. Let's move on to slide 2, which is protection groups. And there are psychological institutions like what I just put up there, the APA, the American Psychological Association in the United States. In the UK, we have the British Psychological Society, BPS, and they make rules for their countries and require similar procedures and compliance. So we may talk about the APA often. They may come up in the course. They are the ones kind of regulating what can be done, what's ethical, and what's not. The federal government has their part as well. They have HIPAA, HIPAA, it's pronounced HIPAA, and that requires physicians to keep patient information confidential. So especially if we're studying people with mental illness, with medical issues, that we can't release who that person is. And that's really important, that confidentiality. So this is important so that those private results statements won't be used against anyone later, that we can do a study and allow people to be open. If they feel like what's being said is going to get out, people will know it's them, they're not going to do it, or they're not going to be truthful. And that's not good. Most of psychological testing is done at universities. That you have PhDs, you have psychologists, psychiatrists, you have people that have studied psychology. So these universities, they have their own institutional review boards that will review experiments before they are done, make sure everything is ethical, no one's being harmed, making sure it's valid, and they're going to screen those proposals. They're going to safeguard the participants. They're going to make sure that the larger guidelines are followed. So each university, so we have the APA that's looking at all of psychological testing, kind of sets the standards. The U.S. government more from the medical side, and then we have each individual university that's screening that. If you're using animals, then we put kind of another layer on top of that. It's called the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. And that's federally mandated. So the federal government says if you're going to do testing on animals, you have to have a board like this that will look at the use of animals and if it's ethical. So every lab that gets federal funding has to do this. So it's not a law, but most public universities will get some type of federal funding, so they have to have one or they can't use animals or their funding will be pulled. And the use of animals has to have the committee to make sure that those animals are treated humanely, that they're being treated fairly. Now, we have some different levels for different animals. Dogs, cats, monkeys are kind of in that highest tier that we treat like humans. We don't want to even psychologically harm them in a study. Rats are used a lot because they're kind of in a lower tier. Not that you can do whatever you want. You don't want to harm them or kill them, but medical testing and some other testing can be used on rats within reason. So that's something that could change in the future if people really catch on to that and feel like those rats are being treated inhumanely. Could happen. So let me put up this slide here. You can pause the video and take this down in your own words. Let's do slide 3. The requirements for experimentation. And the rules are very detailed in terms of requirements. You don't have to know the detailed requirements for experimentation. So we can kind of reduce them to 4 big rules. If you get a question about ethics, then remember these rules. And if these have happened, then you're good. Number 1, obtain informed consent. So the APA and the BPS dictate this. No matter where you are in the US, in the UK, you have to get consent. So the test subjects have to know they're being tested. They have to sign a consent form that tells them kind of what they're in for, and is honest with them. You don't necessarily have to tell them what the study is, but you have to say, hey, you're going to take this pill. There's some possible side effects. This is what could happen, so that they know. And this includes children from their parents. If I want to test children, their parents have to sign a consent form. So if you ever see an experiment that does not mention about kids, it does not mention a consent form, then that's an ethical violation. And that has to be upfront and center, even in just describing an experiment. So same thing. They have to be told what it is, and you have to make sure, especially with kids, that there's no long-term or short-term trauma or harm. That leads into number 2, protect from physical, emotional, and psychological harm and discomfort. So that's pretty general. Physical, emotional, psychological harm and discomfort. So it's not just this is really going to mess you up for life, or this is going to give you problems. But even just discomfort, even if you're not comfortable, that's something that needs to be set up front. And generally, we want to stay away from it. We want to find ways to not have that discomfort happen to participants. Number 3, keep information confidential about participants. This is HIPAA. So you cannot release who was in the study, what happened, just kind of the demographics of who they are. And number 4, fully debrief people afterwards to let them know what they participated in. And this is one that I think we often neglect. So when we talk about single blind or double blind studies, we don't want the people that are in the study to know what's being tested. But afterwards, we can tell them. We have to tell them. That is part of the requirement. They have to know what was actually happening. That's really important. So that's something to keep in mind. Keep in mind with this. So let me put up the slide, and we'll finish up. You can write down the slide in your own words. This is very brief, but this is an important part that we have to keep in mind when you look at a study. You may be asked what those ethical violations are, and we'll take a look at that later today as well. Thanks for taking the Unit 1 notes. I know it's kind of a lot, kind of a slog, but it's a good foundation for AP Psych, and we'll come back to all of these often.